Member Week is here at Lowe's. Don't miss your chance to get up to 40% off hundreds of items like paint, faucets, vanities, doors, and more. Shop our exclusive deals happening in-store and online now through July 18th. Not a member? Join My Lowe's Pro Rewards for free today and get ready to save more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
If you want to feel more connected to humanity and a little less alone, listen to Beautiful Anonymous. Each week, I take a phone call from one random anonymous human being. There's over 400 episodes in our back catalog. You get to feel connected to all these different people all over the world. Recent episodes include one where a lady survived a murder attempt by her own son. But then the week before that, we just talked about Star Trek. It can be anything. It's unpredictable. It's raw. It's real. Get Beautiful Anonymous wherever you listen to podcasts.
Brewers have a tendency to worry about, well, a lot of things. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this worry is misplaced. At the very least, the intentions behind these concerns make some sense. I mean, we all want to make the best beer possible. Now, while some continue to fervently hang on to these old beliefs, others have been, loosening their attachments to certain claims, for better or for worse. You're listening to the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Jordan Folks to yet again talk about a topic I find oddly fascinating: the impact fermenting with Kettle Trub has on beer, this time with a focus on West Coast Pilsner.
Trub has got to be one of the biggest homebrewing boogeymans. Truby man, I don't know. And it was the very first Brülosophy experiment, wasn't it?
It sure was, yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you hear a lot of lore as a young home brewer. At least we used to back in the day. Maybe we don't talk about it as much anymore. And I kind of always wondered, did it actually make a difference? And then I started hearing that maybe it could even lead to expedition of staling or, reduction of some of those beautiful malt flavors and aromas that we're seeking. And so I started messing around with getting rid of as much as I can, but was actually interested to see, does it actually make a difference?
Yeah, exactly. And not only was, the Kettle Trub experiment the very first one we ever published on the website, it was also the very first episode of the podcast. That was our focus, which I think is an indicator of my weird fascination with this variable overall. Now, I've said before that my original aim when starting Brülosophy was to intentionally ruin beers by going against the conventional wisdom. I'm a weirdo like that, and I was okay accepting that risk. That's exactly what I expected from that first Kettle Trub experiment, but that's not at all what happened, and those results ended up being my primary motivation to continue testing other brewing variables. Now, I believe I've brewed the majority of our Kettle Trub experiments, though you recently examined the impact it has on a West Coast Pilsner, Jordan, and I look forward to seeing how it compares to other styles that we've tested. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small monthly pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, July of 2025, is the Executive Director of the American Homebrewers Association, Julia Hertz. The AHA was founded all the way back in 1978, and it's been a huge advocate for homebrewing ever since. While it saw record membership just a few years ago, things really did start to change recently, which ultimately led to the AHA parting ways with the Brewers Association, and Julia has been a huge part of this transition. Just based on comments that we've received on prior episodes where we've talked about our opinions about what's going on with the AHA, I thought it'd be cool for our patrons to get the chance to ask Julia their questions directly, and we are insanely grateful to her for making the time for us to do that. If you'd like to be a part of this session, all you have to do is make a pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brülosophy by Saturday, July 26th, as Julia's going to be hanging out on Sunday, the 27th. And if you're looking for something else in terms of rewards, just a few bucks more will qualify you for rewards like monthly hangouts with Brülosophy contributors and even regular private consultation. We really do try to make your support of what it is we're doing here worthwhile. You can learn more about all of the rewards we offer over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd appreciate that, as well as it helps those who have not heard of us yet to more easily find the show. Plus, we really do appreciate knowing what you all think about how we're doing. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, and as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and I'm telling you, these things are awesome. Clawhammer Supply really does put the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. If you've been considering going electric, though, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We're confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Tony Martinez had some feedback after listening to episode 379, where we shared our opinions on where brewing and beer seems to be headed. Tony said, "I couldn't agree more that there are a lot of people who still brew because the style they want isn't available, or maybe the specific beer of that style isn't available due to limited distribution for many craft breweries. Even though I'm in an area that has access to tons of great beer, including imported beers from Europe, they usually don't arrive in the best condition and aren't stored cold. A motivator for me to keep brewing is to see if I can make something close to what those beers were when they left the brewery." What say you, Jordan?
I'm really in the same boat. I love European lagers and, Belgian ales, and we just are not able to get them, brewery fresh, like you can across the pond, as it were. And so that's definitely something I'm chasing, is trying to make the most authentic beers as possible. And in my basement, and trying to get, something approaching as good as you might be able to get over in Europe.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I really appreciate what you said about your motivation to keep brewing as being the ability to match the quality of what you can get at a brewery. It's true that a lot of people brew for the purpose of access to otherwise inaccessible styles or even brands. I mean, I know people who can't get their hands on, say, Pliny the Elder. And so Vinny has that, the recipe online. They go and they brew that. And maybe it's not exactly the same. I mean, we all have our thumbprint. Every brewery is going to produce a slightly different flavor, but it can get you closer than being unable to taste it at all. And I think that's really cool. There's also just something cool about serving friends a beer that I made and having them comment that it tastes just as good, if not better, than something made by a professional. So that's a motivator for me. But I agree with you, Tony. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where we go with this motivation to brew, and if we're going to be able to motivate people who have never brewed to jump into the game and stick in it as long as we have. So thank you so much for the email, Tony. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Alrighty, when we're back from this break, our focus will be on the impact Kettle Trub has on a West Coast Pilsner.
Imagine you're a business owner relying on a dozen different software programs, each one disconnected, more expensive, and more complicated than the last. It can be incredibly stressful, right? Now, picture Odoo. Odoo brings all the tools your business needs into one simple platform. CRM, accounting, inventory, manufacturing, marketing, HR, and more. All seamlessly connected. Everything works together, giving you the peace of mind that your business is running smoothly from every angle. Odoo's open source applications are user-friendly and designed to scale with your business, saving you time and money. Say goodbye to juggling multiple platforms and hello to efficient, integrated management. Stop wasting resources on complicated systems and make the switch to Odoo today. Visit odoo.com, ODOO.com, and discover how Odoo can simplify and streamline your business operations. Odoo, modern management made simple.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today.
All right, quick break. Knock, knock. Who's there? Amazon Music. Amazon Music who? Amazon Music, where Prime members can listen to top comedy podcasts ad-free. No awkward interruptions, just nonstop laughs from your favorite shows. It's free, it's funny, and hey, it's better than my knock-knock jokes. Download the Amazon Music app and let the good times roll. Or go to amazon.com/ad-free comedy. That's amazon.com/ad-free comedy to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Like probably all brewers, when I made my first batch, my grasp of brewing jargon was, it was not that good. I got the basics down pretty quickly, but there were just some terms I only learned about through dedicated research. One of those being Trub, or as some people refer to it, Trub, which I presumed it came from Germany, though when I Googled, did Google Translate, there was no translation for Trub, so I'm not even sure if it's like where it's from. It just sounds kind of German, if you ask me. So what exactly is Trub, Jordan?
Well, Trub, in my opinion, is kind of just anything that's not the liquid in your wort. And so I think scientifically we're looking at probably some sort of amalgamation of particulates, things like proteins and tannins, even lipids and hot matter that have, injected themselves into the wort. And if you wait long enough, will actually fall out of suspension and leave that, big layer of Trub at the bottom of your boil kettle.
Yeah, and my understanding when I looked up the etymology of the word Trub, it says that it does stem from Germany, but that it actually just means cloudy or turbid, and that makes sense because when you think about the arguments to remove Trub from wort, at least what I remember hearing, back 15, 20 years ago was the main reason you did that was so that your beer didn't end up cloudy or turbid looking. So maybe that does make sense. It doesn't have a direct translation. It just has that meaning to it. So, but yeah, general claims about Kettle Trub, and then we're going to go over some of our past experiment findings that we have discussed on this show before. Is that if you ferment with high amounts of Trub, it's going to lead not only to a hazier beer, but a potential beer with or potential off flavors in that beer. And again, from a very superficial perspective, this always made sense to me, Jordan. If your hazy wort leads to hazy beer, why wouldn't it do that? And I have a feeling a lot of people can relate with that sentiment too, that hey, the clearer the wort when you're fermenting, the clearer the beer is going to be in the end.
I mean, one would think, right? But we've learned a lot about haze over the last decade or two as people have been chasing these hazy IPAs and finding all sorts of interesting things that are haze positive, haze negative. That reminds me of like the big Carafoam debate. Does this thing actually increase your head retention?
Yeah.
There's all sorts of counterintuitive things in this hobby, and Trub and haze might be one of them.
Yeah. I mean, and the wild thing is, so we talked earlier about the fact that the very first Brülosophy experiment was the impact Kettle Trub had on a cream ale. I chose a cream ale because that was before I was comfortable fermenting lagers warm. And I thought, man, what better style than a basic, non-complicated, just crisp cream ale to show the negative impact that fermenting with Kettle Trub might have. Now, we had not adopted the triangle test just yet, so that article is quite a bit different than what you'd see on the website today, but the fermentation was active and strong in the high Trub batch, much more so, visibly at least to my eyes, than the fermentation in the non-Trub batch. And then in the end, the clarity of the batch that had Trub in it was actually better than the batch that didn't. So, you use the term counterintuitive. This blew my mind because there were people who were like, wait a minute, you must have switched up your beers. There's no way it would be the opposite of what everybody expected. But sure enough, they were quite a bit different. But the one that had the high Trub arguably had more benefit or, positive things about it than the non-Trub one. I mean, just blew my mind.
So what about clarity and flavor? What was different between the two?
Well, so, I mean, mind you, this was over 14 years ago. And again, we didn't do the triangle test necessarily. So, but in that one, what I remember, and again, this is going to be my anecdote. My recollection was that the batch that had the higher amount of trub, and I should put a little disclaimer, this was not like 100% of the trub. This was more like I just didn't wait for the wort to settle. And so I racked over what amounted to probably about, I don't know, maybe 2 cups worth of trub versus, just a tiny little dusting of trub because I allowed the other batch to fully settle out. So again, we've done experiments and such on, just dumping the entire contents of the boil into the fermenter. And then we've done more so like this cream ale one where it was just kind of a reasonable amount of trub where you're not focused on reducing it. So the one that had the trub though was in my mind, on my palate, I should say, was crisper and cleaner tasting than the one without it. And the one that without the trub was brewed otherwise the same way I think most people back then at least were fermenting cream ale. You racked as the cleanest wort possible into the fermentation vessel. You pitch your yeast cool, with an adequate amount. Everything was identical between these except for the trub amount, and they came out being slightly different. I just thought it was fascinating.
So I have some theories as to what's going on there, but I'm curious. I don't think you mentioned the clarity. Did they look similar?
The beers, they looked similar, but they looked in terms of like color and stuff. But when you looked at the clarity, they were different, and like I said, the one that was made with the trub, was clearer than the one that wasn't made without the trub. You can go and check this out, by the way. This isn't even the experiment we're focusing on for this episode. This is the very first experiment we ever published. And, you look at the pictures. I've got it up in front of me right now. And what we called the Truby batch, was just slightly more clear, than the one that wasn't. Now the one that didn't have trub in it was still clear, but it wasn't bright. The one that had the trub was like commercial bright.
Right. And so I think that what might be going on here is there's ostensibly a third impact that trub could have, which is fermentation. And there's evidence that suggests that higher amounts of trub could actually lead to reduced lag and even a more active fermentation. And we think that's because trub is really rich in nutrients, and these kind of endogenous nutrients that exist in the trub could provide some sort of fermentation booster.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's exactly what was happening, is you had a more healthy fermentation in your normal trub batch, and maybe that also assisted with flocculation and other types of kind of more ideal fermentation and conditioning conditions.
Yeah.
And perhaps if there's a little bit of trub making it into your fermentation vessel, you don't need yeast nutrient as long as your yeast is of reasonable health, because you're already getting it from the trub and thereby getting a healthier fermentation.
Yeah, and we all know that healthy fermentations have a ton of downstream downstream benefits. And maybe it is that there is this impact on clarity as well. I know a lot of people don't necessarily talk about it that way, but the truth is we have shown consistently that when we do these trub experiments, and we have had a few come back significant, that's not our focus right now, but those are like very particular variables that we're like throwing in to really try to boost this negative impact of trub, or whatever the impact of trub. So it's fascinating to me that fermentation could, it does seem to consistently be improved when you're fermenting with trub, and then that also seems to have an impact on the clarity. So just something that goes in the face of the conventional wisdom that I thought was interesting. That being said, the traditional approach is to remove as much trub as possible from the wort prior to fermentation. And there are a few ways that brewers have employed to do this. And we'll start by using talking about what is the simplest one, which is, allowing the wort to settle and then decanting the wort off the top of that. Trub is really just clumped together proteinaceous gunk from the wort that becomes heavier than the wort itself, heavy enough at least to fall to the bottom of the kettle, leaving this nice clear wort on the top of that you can then gently transfer off, leaving the vast majority, if not all, trub behind. For me, when I cared much more about clear wort in the fermentation vessel, all I would do is when the wort was chilled in the kettle, I always use an immersion chiller. I would just let it settle for 15 to 20 minutes and it would be, almost crystal clear. You could see through a nice pale wort all the way to the bottom trub layer. And then I would just gently rack it off, the trub and I would get it in there. You have a different approach that you still employ to this day, right, Jordan?
Well, yeah, there's one other, the problem with the method that you just described is that a lot of kettles, the, out port is too low.
Yeah.
And even if you wait that 15 minutes, it's still sucking some in. After you finish, evacuating all the wort out of your boil kettle, you're going to see a trub layer below that. But if you watch your line, or like I've done, actually transfer that into a clear carboy, you can see a ton of trub still makes it in, and a lot of systems. And so one thing that I learned from the Lodo community is that you can do a kind of like secondary settling vessel where you get as clear of wort as you possibly can into a carboy. And then especially with lagers where we're not able to get those cold enough for cold pitching temperatures anyway from groundwater cooling, you can cap that and then put it in a fermentation chamber to finish chilling to lager pitching temps. And then when you pull it out, you can see a pretty significant layer of trub has settled yet again, even from trying to collect as clear of wort as possible from the first stage. And so this kind of settling and decanting approach, where you basically just rack truly clear wort off of the trub, in my opinion, is really one of the only ways to get a truly trub-free wort stream into your fermenter, just because it's really hard to get 100% of it separated in the kettle alone.
Yeah, without a doubt. And my little trick for racking out of the kettle, absolutely, oftentimes, especially if you're brewing hoppier beers, which we will be talking about later in this episode because that's kind of the focus of this experiment that we're going to be getting to. Most of the trub experiments that we've done outside of this one were on less hoppy styles. But if you're brewing a massively, kettle hopped beer, that trub layer is going to be even thicker. And so my little trick is I would just take a 2x4 and shove it under the front of my kettle so that the trub would settle to the back of the kettle. And then whatever loss I have, that wort loss, it's usually not much from, obviously some wort is going to be left in the back of the kettle with that trub as well. But the trub really does kind of compact in there, allowing me to get, really clear. If you let it settle long enough, really clear wort. But the settling vessel approach is obviously going to be the best way. And then I've friends who do the same thing, and what they'll do is use like a siphon and to rack from the very top of that wort, and then they kind of gently lower the siphon down to leave as much trub even in the settling vessel behind as they can. Again, the idea here is that one, having trub in your fermentation could lead to a hazier beer, which is not a good thing when you don't want a hazier beer, but it can also ostensibly, impart off flavors. And so we're trying to avoid that. Outside of settling, there are some interesting products that have been released over the last decade or so to help, separate trub, at least bigger chunks of trub from the wort. One of them is called the Trubinator. It's made by Brew Tools. This thing looks like an utter pain in the ass to me. I've never used one, but it's like this flat filter thing that you connect to the valve at the bottom of your kettle, and it will what it claims to leave the trub in the bottom of the kettle while, filtering it out. And so that you get clear wort in your fermentation vessel. Another one that I've seen is called the Bouncer Inline Wort Filter. I know that Jake, previous contributor, was using one of these for a while. I'm not sure how effective it was. I've seen a setup online where somebody put like 3 inline, so it was getting like triple filtered. And this is wort. We're talking just wort from the kettle to the fermentation vessel. I'm sure that works. Probably the easiest way to filter is to use like a sieve or, a hop or a grain bag. I saw somebody, no joke, he was probably doing it to be funny, but he put a clean sock over his the valve on his kettle and ran his wort through that into the fermentation vessel. It would work. And if your goal is to leave as much trub behind as possible, that's one way to assist in doing that as well.
I actually have a bouncer, and I was not a fan. It either doesn't do much or it gets clogged. So I think that one didn't really last. You don't really see people using those anymore. But, with the sock, if we're, using a toilet part to, separate our wort, why not use a sock to separate it further?
Yeah, and if you're looking for, a little funk in that beer, no, use a clean sock if you're going to go for it. But I have seen it. People refer to like hop bags as hop socks as well. I mean, it's made of a material that is very tightly woven that liquid can still flow through. That's all you're looking for. I have never used anything like that. I've always kind of relied on the settling method, which is assisted by the use of kettle finings. These just are products that you add to your wort, usually at the end of the boil, just to encourage good flocculation, to encourage that nice cold break so that it settles out. The most popular being the very cheap and yet insanely effective Irish moss. Irish moss is just dried red algae that contains carrageenan, and carrageenan is a negatively charged compound that attracts positively charged proteins and other haze-forming materials. So here's the cool thing. In all of the kettle finings that are used for this purpose, carrageenan is really the product to focus on. They all have some level or type of carrageenan in it. Whirlfloc is another popular option. These are just compressed tablets of Irish moss and purified carrageenan. And then Polyclar, which I've never used, I'm curious if you have, Jordan, is a non-biological wort clarifier and beer stabilizer. It's optimized, an optimized composition of purified food-grade kappa carrageenan, and especially modified with polyvinyl polyprolidone, PVPP. I don't know what that is. It sounds like a plastic, but it's kind of like Irish moss and Whirlfloc. It's just non-biological, and it's added toward the end of the boil in the same way.
I actually forgot about that stuff. No, I've never used it, but I remember it being talked about back in the day. I think the homebrewing world didn't really latch onto that one.
Yeah, it does seem when I was reading about it on the website, the Polyclar website, or whoever it is that produces this stuff, and it does seem more targeted towards like the commercial brewer. But I'm not sure many commercial brewers are using it either, for reasons that we'll talk about and that we've kind of mentioned already, that, it may not really have as big of an impact. And if you're filtering your beer in any way, or you're long lagering your beers, all that stuff is eventually going to fall out or be filtered out anyways. So I'm not even sure what commercial breweries are using in the kettle, if they're finding it all or what. It'd be interesting to learn that. But there are some factors to consider when it comes to kettle trub in the fermentation vessel. One of those is the amount of trub in the fermenter. Like I mentioned earlier, not all, but most of our experiments are on transferring basically not worrying about the amount of kettle trub that makes it to the fermentation vessel, but without pouring 100% of it in the fermenter. Trub is made up of all kinds of stuff. It's obviously going to have hops in it, but it's going to have these proteins that coagulate during the boil that fall out, as well as lipids, which is a fat. And, that you think about too much of that stuff being in your beer during fermentation, it makes sense to me that the breakdown of those lipids is going to contribute, or could contribute, if there's too much of it, some pretty undesirable flavors.
Right. And so some of the classic ones you might hear about is autolysis, where when yeast die, they break down and release compounds that impart really gross flavors, like raw meat is the one you hear a lot, or sulfur, burnt rubber, an unpleasant, sharp bitterness. And so, autolysis is supposed to take several months, but maybe, sitting on that trub before packaging could be part of it. And so ostensibly, if it's making it into your fermenter, it could be, maybe if you're lagering or something, or just a really long primary, maybe this could contribute to more autolysis. But you're also hearing things like maybe it could allow for the reuptake of certain undesirable byproducts. But there's a couple other ones that I think that are important here. One is the Lodo guys claim that it could be kind of damaging all of the Lodo work that you did prior upstream, and that the oxidation of the wort could be expedited or exaggerated as a result of trub making it into your fermenter. And so, they put so much effort into mitigating oxygen on the hot side. They're going to do everything they can, downstream as well. And apparently part of that is separating it from the trub. Relatedly, or another one that I've heard was actually on the Brew Lab, where Cade interviewed a brewing scientist, and they talked about how there was actually some concerns with trub and hoppy beers specifically, that it could lead to expedited staling and lower quality products if you have, Trub making it from your kettle into the fermenter. I think that one was definitely concerned about hop particulate being a portion of the Trub. And so that's kind of where my mind was going when thinking about what new style could we test. Is I don't think we had done a hoppy beer yet. And at the same time, I was really interested in this kind of Lodo theory on improving the product quality in lagers specifically, and really getting as clear of wort as possible into your fermenter. And so my thought was, well, why don't we look at a hoppy lager?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good one. And I've heard the same thing about the potential for staling. And this is another consideration, that I have in my notes is in addition to the amount of Trub that makes its way to the fermenter, how long are you going to be aging this? It may very well be that you can ferment with a bunch of Kettle Trub, and it has all of those positive benefits on the fermentation side of things. You get clearer beer in the end. You get a nice reduced lag, which is an active fermentation. That's all fine and dandy. But if you're going to be holding on to this beer for a month or two, is that going to negatively impact things as well? I performed an experiment all the way back in 2018 where we tested that out. And without getting into too many details, perhaps we'll focus on it in a future episode. That was one of the few Trub experiments that came back significant. Was massive amount of Trub stored in a beer that was stored over time. All of the same observable stuff. The high Trub batch was clearer. It had an active fermentation. All of that. It just also tasted different. Now, preference is subjective, so I'm not going to get into what the taster said about that. But again, just something to keep in mind. I think it's interesting. So, like you said, is it autolysis? Is it, what is it that's contributing this flavor? Is it the breakdown of those lipids? Is it oxidation? Like you mentioned, the Lodo people talk about. All of that on some level, given my rudimentary understanding of the brewing process, having done this for so long, sort of makes sense. So I can understand the drive to kind of, want to avoid it if it could even potentially have a negative impact on your beer. Now, we mentioned, the endogenous nutrients that come with Trub. If you are the type of person who just wants to completely eliminate Trub from your beer, you can add, I have not done this in an experiment. I think it'd be a great future experiment, but I've absolutely done, just to test it out, made a single batch, nice, pale, clean, wort that I reduced as much Trub as possible in the fermenter and just added yeast nutrient. And I got the same, reduced lag, active fermentation, and nice, clear outcome in the end. So there are, there are workarounds if you don't want to include that much Trub. We're not saying that the only way for you to get a good active fermentation and clear beer is to ferment with Trub. Of course not. So tell us a little bit about West Coast Pilsner, because that is the style that we focused on in this experiment. It's nice and hoppy and yet pale lager-like, but it's not a style that's recognized by the BJCP, at least not yet.
Yeah, I don't think the BJCP does yet, but I believe that the Great American Beer Fest or World Beer Cup people, they have some sort of category for it now, I think. And in my opinion, it is really the best of both worlds. It's kind of like German Pilsner, maybe Czech Pilsner meets West Coast IPA. So you have that ABV and lager fermentation of a kind of standard strength German Pilsner, 4.5%, 5.5% or so, combined with the hop character of a West Coast IPA. And so we're talking similar levels of whirlpooling, similar levels of dry hopping. The bitterness might be a little bit more restrained, more like 40, 50 IBUs instead of, 70 or something like that. But when we look at the modern West Coast IPA, those IBU levels are coming down to that kind of range anyway. So if anything, these could have a fairly high BU to GU ratio relative to current modern West Coast IPAs that might have a similar IBU, but just more strength.
Yeah.
And so you get that refreshing, drinkability and kind of, inherent moderation that comes with a lower, ABV beverage, but with all the hop character that we're getting, accustomed to in the IPA world.
Oh, so an IPL? No, it's not an IPL. Oh, so a cold IPA? No, it's not a cold IPA. It's so funny, all of the dramatic, controversy that's behind all of these hoppy lagers and what do you call it and what is it? West Coast Pilsner, my understanding, I don't know, perhaps you have some deeper knowledge about this since you love West Coast Pilsner so much. I do too. You brew it way more often. My understanding is that it was first brewed in 2016 at Highland Park Brewery down in Los Angeles, and it really wasn't even brewed. I could be wrong, but I believe what they were doing initially was just blending their house Pilsner and their West Coast IPA and calling it a West Coast Pilsner, which makes perfect sense. And I'd be interested to do a comparison of a blended one, and just for fun, and then next to an actual brewed West Coast Pilsner. But either way, like you said, it is a very arguably very hoppy Pilsner, and you're using a lot of the same brewing techniques to make that you would if making a Pilsner, but you're just adding hops at certain times and treating that piece of it a little bit more like an IPA. To me, a really ideal style to test this Kettle Trub thing out on a hoppy beer. One of the arguments we get anytime we use an IPA for an experiment is, well, of course you didn't taste the difference. It's an IPA. It's so hoppy. It's hiding the flavor differences or whatever. Well, sometimes you have to test it on hoppy stuff to see if there's going to be an impact. So now Kettle Trub wasn't something that I initially worried about when I first started brewing. In fact, I don't think I even encountered that term until I switched to all grain brewing back in 2010 and became willingly obsessed with beer and brewing. Like many, I just accepted what I was reading and hearing from those that I imbued with some level of authority. And it wasn't until the first Kettle Trub experiment, that cream ale one, that I began to question the negative claims about Kettle Trub. But that was just one data point. Jordan, you recently revisited this variable, though chose a much hoppier style, West Coast Pilsner. We're going to be talking about that experiment and getting into those results as soon as we're back from this break. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brülosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Exchillerator.com today.
All right, quick break. Knock, knock. Who's there? Amazon Music. Amazon Music who? Amazon Music, where Prime members can listen to top comedy podcasts ad-free. No awkward interruptions, just nonstop laughs from your favorite shows. It's free, it's funny, and hey, it's better than my knock-knock jokes. Download the Amazon Music app and let the good times roll. Or go to amazon.com/ad-free comedy. That's amazon.com/ad-free comedy to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Over the years, we've performed well over 500 individual experiments, and in order to give tasters the best chances of perceiving the impact of whatever variable it is we're testing out, we usually opt for relatively tame, arguably boring styles by some, by which I just mean they're pale in color, low to moderate strength. Usually they have less hops than, a pale ale or an IPA. However, having already tested Kettle Trub's impact during fermentation so many times on such styles, these, pale, kind of boring styles, you went with something a little bit different given claims about the impact Kettle Trub can have on hoppier styles, Jordan.
Yeah, and I'm always kind of secretly scheming for trying to find ways to make my IPAs or West Coast Pilsners into experiments. It's like I just love hoppy styles so much, and got to find reasonable examples of testing a hoppy beer, and this is a really good example of that, given what we heard in the brew lab, that there were serious concerns around Trub levels and the impact of their quality on hoppy beers.
Yeah.
So I put it to the test and brewed a couple batches of West Coast Pils.
Yeah, like I said, I really think this was a great, a great design. After, given what we had already done with Kettle Trub during fermentation on these kind of pale, less characterful styles. So this will be our first foray, or was our first foray into, looking at what Kettle Trub, what impact that can have during fermentation on a hoppier style. But like we said earlier, it's a hoppier style that still has a lot of the characteristics of a nice Pilsner. So again, kind of the best of both worlds in terms of our, what we like to drink, but also for this test, in my opinion.
Right. So let's get into the recipe. So this is a West Coast Pils, made 2 dual identical 5-gallon batches in my 240 volt claw hammer units. And I just use Pilsner malt in these beers. I tend to keep European varieties on hand, but an American variety would work just fine. And I just use whatever I have on hand. And so at this point, I had a chest full of Czech Pilsner malt. And so that's what I use. So just 100% Czech Pils malt is my grist.
Beautiful. One of my favorite ways to brew is single malt and single hops if I'm making like a Czech Pilsner or something like that. But you really get, a lot of flavor from this low kilned Pilsner malt. And my favorite Pilsner malt I've ever used was the Dingemans Bohemian Pilsner that I just think is absolutely delicious. It really imparts this nice rich flavor that I think is going to contribute, that Pilsner-like character to this hoppier version of the style.
Yeah, and so for these, I just do a single infusion mash. We're really trying to drive attenuation here, and so just 147F or 64C for an hour. After that mash was complete, I removed those grains and proceeded to just boil for another hour with 14 grams of mosaic at 60 minutes, and then 71 grams of mosaic, another 71 grams of Motueka for a 10-minute hop stand after killing the boil.
So you look at this, this hop schedule. This is not a West Coast IPA hop schedule. I mean, maybe you beg to differ on this one, Jordan. I know you brew more West Coast IPA than I ever have, but you're doing a basic bittering edition and then a hop stand edition. So you're going a 60-minute boil without adding. Well, with making just one initial hop edition. Is that correct?
That's right.
And the purpose behind that is the purpose behind that to really emphasize just the hop aromatics without contributing any more bitterness, or?
Yeah, there's a couple things going on there. One is I want to be able to get as much aroma as possible through the aroma hop stand, whirlpool step. And so you just don't have as much room for upfront bitterness like a mid-boil edition when you're trying to maximize your whirlpool edition, because, you're going to get some sort of level of isomerization and some level of both measurable and perceived bitterness.
Yeah.
And so given that our starting gravity is in that lager range, I just can't put as many BUs into this beer and still make it pleasurable. So I skip the mid additions for that reason. Also, I was advised by Ghost Town on how they were doing their process when I first started looking into making this style. And I believe I was also copying them, that I don't think that they were doing any sort of mid-boil addition other than bittering and whirlpool. So a little bit of a appeal to authority, but it seems to be working well, and not wanting to over bitter this thing, given that we're looking at 1045, 1050 OG kind of beer.
Yeah, I mean, I've had your West Coast Pilsner. Don't change what you're doing. It's probably some of the best beer I've ever drank, and I get around, So whatever you're doing, it works. Now you're going to hear some really interesting hop stuff as we get into the dry hop phase. That is coming. But where did you end up with the OG on this one? And I'm curious if where you ended up is kind of the general, where you want to be with a West Coast Pilsner.
Yeah, these are really where you want to be at 1047 OG. And so far, both are showing the same OG. And so that's always nice. Even though you're doing everything identical side by side, it's really hard to hit the same exact numbers on these things. You'll get these digital units, you'll get a little bit of temperature swing on one and not the other. Or, maybe the granularity of a grain scale is like an ounce or something off on either batch. And so it's always nice when they're right on the money.
Yeah, without a doubt. We went from the very beginning, when I built out my first dual batch, specifically for the experiment series setup, one of the things I was so focused on and why I made sure that everything between my setups were identical, I mean, down to the tubing I used, was that I wanted to ensure that the only possible explanation for a difference was the implementation of whatever variable it was that I was looking at. So in this case, the fact that they both turned out at 1047, first off, I love that OG. That is a crushable beer regardless of where it finishes at. But also, we're still equal, which you would expect. We have not introduced the variable yet, but we are now to the point where that variable is going to be coming into play.
Right. So what I did is I put in my immersion chiller, the SS Hydra, I believe is the model there, and let that chill out and then settle for 15 minutes in the kettles. And so that, achieved some level of flocculation of the trub to the bottom of the kettle. And then I used a racking cane to transfer as clear of wort as possible, kind of in like that layered approach where you start the bottom of the racking cane at the top and then slowly push it down as it's continuing to draw the liquid off, trying to mitigate as much trub pickup as possible into a sanitized clear glass carboy. Whereas the other one, I just stuck it straight in the bottom and racked from the bottom truby wort into another carboy. Now, if you go into the website and look at the article, you can see a pretty drastic difference in the amount of trub content that existed between these carboys, but I was not done. And I actually put those in my fermentation chamber. And again, I mentioned this trick earlier, is if you're not going to be able to get to pitching temp anyway, in a world where you're doing a cold fermented lager, you might as well, use this step to both continue chilling and continue precipitating out any trub. Mm-hmm. So once we got down to 47F or 8C, my desired pitching temperature, I pulled those clear glass carboys out, and you could see that a finer smaller trub layer had settled in the low trub batch, whereas the high trub batch, there was a ton that was sitting at the bottom of there. And we only show the initial stage on the website. But what I did is I then racked off of the trub in the clear trub batch. Just really getting virtually zero into my fermenter. Whereas the other one, I was just like writhing around the racking cane and just constantly steering up and pumping the trubiest shit I could possibly get out of that carboy into my fermenter. So this is really a pretty dramatic difference in terms of trub, that maybe the most that we've ever done like this, in terms of one is ostensibly zero trub and the other one is as truby as you could possibly get.
Mm-hmm. And well, I'll tell you, I mentioned it in the last segment. I did one where that had a ton of trub, kind of like what you're talking about. It sounds like you even went further, and bear in mind, your trub had a bunch of hop matter in it as well, whereas mine did not. So those are, additional factors that I hadn't looked at yet. But I'm looking at the photo right now, that like you said, the one on the website, and my goodness, do they look different. In my mind, based on what I know about that prior experiment with a lot of trub that was aged over time, I'm thinking right off the bat, if there's going to be a difference, this is going to be the type of experiment that shows that difference. So,
and this is one of those ones where you're just cringing when you're doing it. You're like, what am I doing? Like, I'm just willingly ruining a batch of beer now. So, all right, so let's get into fermentation. And so we went ahead and fermented these at 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10C. And that's for West Coast Pilsner. That's a pretty standard temperature. I'm using Imperial L26 Pilgrimage at this time. God, I miss that strain. That's the Undeck strain. Love that strain for both lagers and hoppy beers. And I like to ferment my West Coast Pils a little warmer for the cold range, like 50F, just so we're not getting as much sulfur production or sulfur capture in the beer. We do not want a sulfury West Coast Pils. And I got to tell you, Marshall, right off the bat, I'm starting to see a difference. I believe the lag time was pretty different, whereas the clear no true batch took longer to kick off. And I also saw attenuation progress go at much different speeds. Ultimately, I needed the no true batch to go a full 3 weeks, 2 weeks at 50F, and then an additional week at 62F or 17C. to finally get a FG, whereas that Truby batch finished way before that. And ultimately, we saw a difference in final gravity and attenuation. No Trub finished at 1009, and high Trub 1007. So we already have some observable differences, at least in terms of fermentation vigor and attenuation, as a function of the Trub level.
Yeah, it's so a couple of things. First off, just to be clear, you did not add exogenous nutrients to either of these batches, in part because we know, at least over time, we've been able to show that higher levels of Trub seem to have a similar effect as adding yeast nutrient to the wort. Just to be clear, you did not add nutrients, right?
Yeah, and so this seems to suggest that that is probably a good idea, is to add nutrients when doing a true separation process like that.
Right. So there's that piece of it, though, and then the part that I they say that good science is repetition. You're not going to find the truth through one data point, through one experiment, and that's why we keep revisiting these variables over and over and over again, making small changes contextually, but still looking specifically at the impact of certain variables. When it comes to Kettle Trub, the one thing that we have consistently seen in every experiment that we have done is exactly what we saw here. Reduced lag, more active fermentation. Now you ferment in, closed fermentation kegs, so you can't really observe fermentation other than through a blow off valve or whatever it might be. But like you said, that high Trub batch attenuated, what was done fermenting well before, probably, I'm assuming, I don't think you mentioned how long it took. I'm assuming after less than a week, even at 50 degrees, that one was down to FG, whereas you had to wait another 2 weeks for the no Trub batch. That is exactly my experience, even when fermenting ales.
Right. Yeah. It's incredible how nutrient, or in I guess this case, and the form of Trub, and temperature can both be really intense levers that you can pull in terms of fermentation speed.
It's crazy, man.
So let's talk hops, because this is definitely a wonderful expression of modern hop products. And we actually omitted this at the top earlier, but at the yeast pitch, there was a dip hop that was added, and that was in the form of 4 grams of Mosaic Incognito, and that's a flowable whirlpool intended product that a lot of people like adding on the cold side as a dip hop. So I just pulled off some hot wort, like straight from the kettle, into like a jar, and added the Incognito into that jar, mixed it around, and then threw that in with the yeast pitch at fermentation. And so that first kind of like extended dry, quote, dry hop, dip hop phase happens during fermentation. And then after that, I do a second hop charge, and that's a kind of a more traditional dry hop. And that was 113 grams of Motueka, and then 20 grams of Mosaic Spectrum, which is another flowable advanced hop product, whereas Spectrum is really designed for dry hopping cold side usage.
Yeah.
So you really, that one using as it's intended to be used.
Yeah, and Spectrum, it's a Haas product just like Incognito, but Spectrum really is intended for dry hopping, meaning that it's not going to contribute weird bitterness or anything like that. But the main thing is, especially on the commercial scale, zero loss because it just dissolves into the beer, which I think is pretty rad. And if you've ever had a beer made with Spectrum, again, I've had your beers made with Spectrum, Jordan. That stuff is potent and amazing. So get your hands on some if you haven't tried it yet.
Yeah, it's a little spendy, but hey, man, IPAs are spendy.
Yeah.
We're not. No one said this hobby was free, right? And IPAs are really
far from, yeah.
an indulgent expense at the homebrew scale, but pint for pint, it's still going to be cheaper than getting it from a brewery or the store.
Yeah.
But dear God, these flowable products really are cheat codes, and you can make some of the best hoppy beers in the world if you're willing to spend the extra money on the Spectrum, the Incognito. Really think it's worth the extra cost, but it is definitely an added cost.
Oh, yeah. I think it was back in 2019. I was up in Yakima for Hop Harvest, and we were hanging out at the Haas headquarters up there. And they have a tasting room where they do all these experimental things. You can imagine I was like a kid in a candy store. And one of the things that they were very excited for us to try was a beer that was made with 0 hops, meaning no T90, no whole cone hops, nothing like that. It was made with all flowable, downstream hop products that Haas was working on at the time, including Incognito, Spectrum, stuff like that. This beer was phenomenally hoppy. So again, we sound like we're a commercial right now. We kind of are. We love Haas. They were a big sponsor of ours for a long time. If you want to make the hoppiest, beers that possible, try these things out. They're pretty incredible. All right. So how long did you leave the beer after adding these dry hop additions?
So they mingled with the dry hops for a day, and then I cold crashed them and then racked them into a serving keg off of the hops, and then let them lager for 3 weeks under pressure to carbonate, clear out, and get ready for evaluation.
All right. So these beers are done. Obviously, I would say that the vast majority of the time, if not 100%, we're drinking these beers before we serve them to tasters. We're testing them to see if they're ready yet. We really want to present the beer, particularly for experiments. We want the beers to be in the best shape possible when we're presenting them to blind tasters. I'm looking at the photo right now on your article, and they don't look nearly as different in terms of clarity, at least. The color's identical. The foam quality looks identical. I mean, I'm trying to pick out a difference in clarity, and I'm just not seeing it in the same way that we have with past Trub experiments. Do you think that is a function of the lagering time, or is there something else at play? Perhaps the hops, the hop amounts or something?
I don't know. I really don't. I think that we noted that they were identical looking. When you look at the photos on the website, maybe you could convince yourself they look a smidge different.
I mean,
but
yeah. Not really.
Effectively look the same. Yeah. And for those that look at the website, basically identical looking, pale gold, striking clarity, stark white cap of foam, good head retention. And I'll also add they tasted really good. Similar levels of aroma, similar, flavors. And so let's see if I can actually get these identified as different when kind of semi-blind, because side by side, they didn't seem to be that different in terms of organoleptic properties, despite the fact that one fermented faster and attenuated more.
Yeah. So again, just to reiterate, the way we do this is we refer to it as a semi-blind tasting because we know the variable, but we either, enlist the help of a loved one, whether that's a partner or a child, which is what I do, to serve us these beers, or we have a weird way where we mix cups up and we use 4 cups and blah, blah, blah. But we basically just do a series of 5 of our own triangle test attempts, just to see if we're able to tell them apart, despite knowing, or perhaps knowing might help us. In this case, you did the 5, semi-blind triangle tests, and how many of those were you able to identify the odd beer out?
I only got it right 2 of the 5 times, and those were lucky guesses. They really seemed perceptibly the same.
So again, on the base, I look at this and I'm like, okay, so it lines up with the majority of other Trub experiments that we've done. The beers taste the same, but there are these observable differences when it comes to more objective measures like reduced lag, like fermentation vigor, FG, stuff like that. I would never expect to taste a difference in beers that were only 2 points different, FG. That's not, you're not going to taste that. But what gets me is that this was not only a highly hopped beer, but you let them age for nearly a month before serving them to tasters. I talked about it earlier, we did an experiment on a much less hoppy beer where I let them age for a while, and that was one of the very few that returned a significant result. So in this case, it does make me wonder if perhaps the higher hopping mounts might be almost kind of like a prophylactic against the negative impact Kettle Trub might have during fermentation.
Yeah, and if there was a, really awful fermentation in one of them, you'd be able to tell, right? You've had my West Coast Pilsners, they're really bright and clean.
Oh.
And a fermentation flaw would be noticeable despite the heavy hopping rate. And so I don't know, if it's prophylactic or what, or maybe it really is a boogeyman because there, like we said, there were observable differences in terms of attenuation and fermentation vigor, but they tasted pretty damn similar.
Man, it's crazy to me. Now, obviously, we have not shared the blind taster results, but I have a feeling you listeners can kind of predict where we're headed with this. You served these beers to 24 participants, out of which 13 would have had to have identified the unique sample, in order for us to say with some level of confidence that it really does seem that the higher level of Trub had a perceptible impact on these beers, given how controlled both of these beers were brewed. Out of those 24, again, you needed 13. How many actually, picked the odd beer out?
11 of 24, which is 46% of tasters, which did not pass our threshold, suggesting that tasters cannot reliably tell the differences between a high Trub and no Trub West Coast Pilsner.
Yeah, so this one was very surprising to me. I think when we were first designing the experiment, when we were going back with the crew, talking about how we wanted to approach this, my initial thought was, yeah, it's not going to come back significant. And then I'm thinking, but wait a minute, West Coast Pilsner, a lot of hops, maybe that's going to have some impact. You got to lager it for some amount of time. Okay, I could see this one being one of the unique ones that comes back significant, and it just didn't. And then you take that blind taster data and you combine it with the fact that you, the brewer, who is a very discerning palate, in my opinion, also couldn't taste a difference. It's very difficult for me to, not believe that the Trub not only didn't have an impact, but that it wasn't in some way good for the beer because of the impact it had on fermentation and all that other stuff we talked about.
This one really blows my mind. And it's just like, how can putting this much muck into the fermenter not be a bad thing? And ostensibly, it was a good thing.
Yeah.
And so,
so weird.
It's really mind-blowing,
Yeah.
I don't remember if there was any difference in yeast quality because I tend to harvest yeast. And so that might be one consideration is you might have a more pure resulting yeast slurry if you're into reharvesting.
Yeah.
But at least in terms of the beer that we're trying to make here in the first place, it doesn't seem to matter that much. And so I'm left scratching my head. It's like, why am I wasting all this time with one more vessel to clean, one more step, the separation process.
Yeah.
Also, having to clean a racking cane when I could just be getting it straight from the kettle itself using the existing infrastructure in place. And Marshall, I got to tell you, this might be the number one experiment in my time at Brülosophy that has influenced how I brew going forward. I no longer do a settling step.
Yeah, I remember when you first joined the crew, we would have to add, I use kind of a template, which people who read the website notice sometimes I forget to change things in those templates. But when we're doing the editing, you guys submit your drafts and I'd go in, I always had to add a paragraph for your settling step. And I noticed starting about a year and a half ago that we're not doing that anymore. And I didn't realize it was because of the results of this experiment. But yeah, it is just wild to me. What I am scratching my head about is, where the hell did this idea that Kettle Trub was it just conjecture on the part of the brewers of yore, the people on whose shoulders we stand? Like, were they just making that up? It's so difficult for me to accept that, but my God, every time we brew, there is actual like university, brewing program studies that confirm what we're finding. And yet still it's widely held that you have to ferment with as little Trub as possible in order to get the clearest beer and have the best fermentation. That's just not the case. It's wild to me where these ideas come from in the first place.
And, we have a pretty ideal setup for brewing and serving beer. Home brewers are the only brewers where the entire batch never leaves the premises.
Yeah.
I guess probably some microbreweries that only do over-the-counter sales. But generally speaking, a lot of that research is thinking about, well, what about a product that sits in a truck, then in a warehouse, then on a shelf before it gets refrigerated, then maybe it goes home and sits in the basement, then it gets refrigerated again. More time, more temperature cycles, maybe something would start to emerge. But at the very least, within the context of a beer that's brewed and then, stays cold and is served on draft fresh the entire time, it didn't make a difference. I think that we might as well, there's no reason to throw all the Trub in, but clearly the standard amount that's making it in is, if anything, providing some level of benefit with seemingly no detriment.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, that's such a good way to look at it too. Now we do have some reader comments we're going to get to, just a couple of them. But before we do that, I do want to just kind of put out there that a few people were, they suggested that you hold on to these beers for a couple more months and collect more data on it, probably inspired by our one past experiment that did return that significant result, which was a much cleaner, lower hopped beer, not cleaner, but way massively less hops, that I let age, I think, for 8 weeks or something like that. I think that's a valid recommendation, but if we're looking at the practicality of that, how many people are aging hoppy beers for 2 to 3 months? You already let this beer sit for upwards of 4 weeks before collecting data. I don't think, that we need to let this beer sit around for another 4 months or 4 weeks to whatever, however long, just to try to prove a point. We're trying to look at the practical application of these variables. And I think you did a great job of that. So that's why I'm not getting to those comments. I think like 4 people, spoke to that. The first comment we are going to get to, though, comes from Norm Ryder, who says, I truly appreciate each article. And as a serious brewer, 60 kegs a year. Woo. I also have done this Trub test many times. Thanks for confirming my conclusions that others have disputed. I appreciate your scientific approach to dispel myths of brewing. Brew on. Before I hand this over to you, Jordan, I don't like to refer to these things as myths so much as misunderstandings. That, we'll let other people use that term if they want to. Again, I think it makes sense that if you accept just this trope that, hazy wort leads to hazy beer, that is on a shallow level, a superficial level. Yeah, it makes sense. It hasn't been proven. Many times it has not been proven. And so we can change our mind, but I don't think people are out there advocating for these things without some, good, goodwill. It's not like they're trying to get people to ruin their beers or anything like that.
Sure. And I think with all the modern, fining approaches now, gelatin or whatever you like to add, we could do a pretty good job of getting haze to knock out. But if the beer doesn't taste any good to begin with, we got a problem. So I think that, better safe than sorry, but it turns out maybe it doesn't matter anyway.
Yeah. Final comment comes from Torbjorn Carlson. He says, I don't know how I would get rid of the Kettle Trub without discarding a lot of wort. Sure, with Whirlflock, it will slowly separate and settle to the bottom of the kettle as it cools, but this takes a long time, and the separation gets slower exponentially. Well, here's the thing, Torbjorn. I don't think you need to worry about it. That's my take on this based on these results, but what do you think, Jordan?
I agree, because it takes forever. It just will never precipitate out, And so at a certain point, it's like if it doesn't make any negative difference and maybe even a slight positive one, I think a normal, process is probably fine.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's funny. It's whenever I talk about like Irish Moss, Whirlflock, stuff like that, it makes me think of this. My wife and I are oddly obsessed with all the Gold Rush shows on Discovery Channel. And there was this one episode we were watching. I don't even know if it was Gold Rush or some offshoot of that, but it was their like mine rescue or something like that. These guys come out and they help these gold miners to try to improve their process and increase their gold yield. And they go to this one mine and there's this, they have their settling pond, and the water that was in this settling pond was just completely turbid and murky, and it was not working very well, going over the wash plant and all of this. And so they bring in this stuff, this chemical stuff that they throw into the water, and within like 20 minutes, it completely coagulates, or as we would say, flocculates the gunk you don't want in there, drops it to the bottom of the pond, and you've got this nice clear water on the top. I'm almost certain it's a carrageenan-based material. So we're essentially using, this industrial product, to separate our wort. I still use Irish Moss. It has nothing to do, though, with me leaving Trub behind as much as it does. We've done did an Irish Moss experiment where the only variable was the use of Irish Moss. And lo and behold, those beers looked a little bit different in the end. I'm not going to get into those results right now, but that's why I use that. I still rack my wort. As soon as I'm done chilling, I rack it over and I leave some of that Trub behind, but I probably bring about, 50, 60% of it over. And I've been quite happy with my results. So that's what I'm going to keep doing. That is all the time we've got for this episode. Please don't forget to check out the killer content that Martin is creating over at the Brülosophy Show, which you can subscribe to at youtube.com/@the Brülosophy Show. Show. That's the @ symbol, followed by The Brülosophy Show with no umlaut. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on Brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me.
If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts.